So we are finishing up the book of Titus. We've been in it for about 2 months now, and we've been talking about the idea of setting things right. And we've seen so far throughout the letter that right away after Paul mentioning that this is what he's wanting Titus to do, he talks about him setting up elders. And it's easy for us to think about that and think that that's the exact way of how you set things right, that the way that you go about doing things is that you need good people who are able to control things and take care of all of the problems that arise. And one of the problems with that is what he gets into right after that is the biggest problem, and why the chaos was actually abounding upon Crete was not what we think about, but instead was people trying to control that chaos and trying to take advantage of the situation. It was that the Jewish Christians were trying to take advantage and manipulate the ignorance of the Gentile Christians into forcing them to follow all of their laws and all their traditions and everything else. And it was causing so much chaos because of their desire to control things that were going on there. And Paul ultimately gives us a different way of looking at things when it comes to how to go about doing this. It even goes to what their understanding of what elders really would have been, of not people who were standing around looking over everyone's neck trying to find them in something they were doing wrong just so that they can correct them, but the people who would sit at the city gates who would offer wisdom and advice and would help settle arguments and other things like that. But they were more there for people to come to seek help from. And it's not that they wouldn't ever go out and help others with it, but they certainly weren't seeking things out. They certainly weren't trying to force everyone to come under their authority or control. In other words, it was basically they had earned the respect. It wasn't that they demanded it, but they had actually earned the respect of the people. And so that's how it was supposed to be. Those who were more mature and had reason to earn the respect of the people were to help and lead those who were less mature, ultimately leading them to God, because that's what it boils down to, that when we really begin to look at things, it is God who's setting things right. Though we may play a role on the part of how that goes about doing, it's God who's actually making all those changes. He's the one who's cleansing and sanctifying and actually taking people from where they were and leading them to where he wants them to be. That God is the one who's truly setting all of that stuff right. And when we try to do it, again, it ultimately only leads to trying to control people. And it leads to what we saw a couple weeks ago about divisiveness, and that becomes the big problem of what's going on here, is that people try to take that control and authority themselves, and it ends up forcing them to divide people of either being following them or following whatever else. And the biggest problem with that is that it led the people away from being able to do the good works that Titus has been talking about, or Paul's been talking about to Titus throughout this entire book, is that that's what it was supposed to lead them to, that besides just setting things right, it was also good works that we've seen constantly talked about in here. But when people are trying to control the situation, when they're trying to do all of this other stuff, it takes them away from being able to actually do any of those things, because their focus is in so many other spots that they can't actually focus on doing what they are called to be doing. And so as we finish up Titus, we see that really the whole point of everything that's been going on here is the idea of letting go of control. That's really what's been pointing toward this entire time, is that the way to set things right ultimately is to let go of control. It basically becomes the opposite of what we tend to think about when it comes to trying to set things right, to try to get them back to where they're supposed to be, that instead of controlling it and manipulating it and trying to make it go a certain way, we have to do the opposite and let go of trying to do that if we're actually going to figure things out. And this becomes a hard thing for us to figure out and to be able to do. And just as much as we saw it then with the Jews and the Gentiles fighting amongst one another, though not all of that obviously is completely gone, but we see so many different ways of people trying to take control and do other things. Just like the Pharisees and other Jewish leaders had made their own rules and traditions and tried to force those upon everyone to explain other things, and they could back it up with all the scripture they wanted to in all these different ways, there are plenty of people still today who try to do some of those things. Even when they're right about stuff, it's still more about controlling people or trying to make them do things their way than it is about them actually finding God and finding the truth and doing things for the right reason. The love of God gets left behind for all of these other expectations. And having grown up and done so many stuff in the church throughout my life, though grace and all this other stuff about what Jesus did was talked about and everything else, and it's not as if it was ignored, it still never felt like that was what it was about. It always felt more like it was about following these specific rules. And there's ones you've probably heard over and over again, but they tend to leave out some of the other things that the Bible even more constantly talks about, like such things as pride and idolatry, and just simply not loving God the way that we're supposed to. The very foundation for everything that it is often left behind and set aside for the sake of wanting all of these other different rules. And that is the way that we see things going. And again, it goes back to the point that it tends to be all about control. Even if that's not the intention of the people, most likely somewhere down the line, there was someone who did just want control, and so they were controlling other people, and it gets passed down through traditions and doctrines and all that other stuff. And then people start teaching it in the same way they've always known, and not even realizing what ultimately the way that they are going about things are doing. So it's not as if this is always an intentional thing, though in plenty of cases it is intentional. It has a tendency of ending up at that point where it's more about controlling people than it's actually about what is even being said in the first place. That you can almost ignore anything that's being said and to actually find the problem because it's about the control that exists behind it. And until we find a way to let go of that control, we get lost in this trap. This section, these last 4 verses of Titus begins with saying, "Whenever I might send Artemis to you, or Tychicus, be zealous to come to me in Nicopolis, for there I have judged to winter. Zealously send on their way Zenas the lawyer and Apollos, in order that nothing might lack to them." It seems like this to me is one great example of how this takes place, is that there are many pastors probably preach a sermon on this first verse and go off in so many different directions on what rules it has to do with ministry or whatever else, that you should only stay in one place for so long before someone else takes over or whatever else, even though there's so little information we actually have on what exactly is happening here. Really what all this is Paul trying to give Titus some instructions, because there is some authority that Paul has over Titus through the relationship that Paul expects Titus to listen to him and do something here, that Paul, for whatever reason, needs Titus specifically, and so he's sending some other people to take over what's going on there on Crete so he can have Titus help him with whatever else is needed. And we have a tendency to forget that sometimes these letters are actually letters written to people, because we try to make it all about us and what it's about, rather than realizing that they were written for a certain reason, but yet at the same time that still gives us some kind of wisdom to be able to deal with certain situations. Like the second verse, it tells them to help send on their way these other people so that nothing is lacking to them. Obviously, if there's people coming through who are trying to do ministry somewhere else and don't really have all the funds with them or whatnot, and they come to us and we have the ability to help them out, we ought to be able to do that in whatever way is necessary. But yet at the same time, there's not certain limitations for what you can do, what you can't do, or whatever. You have to judge that based upon the situation itself. You really have to use some kind of common sense that isn't going to be specifically explained in this. And the point with all of this is that there are many who try to use the Bible to control people in ways that it was never intended to be. They start assuming things or adding stuff or taking stuff away or doing whatever they want with it, ultimately to make it say whatever they want. And when you say it enough times, and then you say something to the extent of it, the Bible clearly says this, people are going to agree with you if they're already being convinced of it, even if it doesn't actually necessarily clearly say this or that or whatever. And it's a tactic that is often used to control people. Again, that's not really the point of what's being said here. It's just simply what Paul wants Titus to be doing, but it's still that reality is that sometimes the Bible has a tendency to be used in ways that are actually controlling towards people rather than actually helping build them up. And it's easy to get caught up in certain stuff like this, like the history in some of the books or the whatever else we think is there, and we miss the actual point that's behind it. But Paul does make a point here. He says, "And let also our ones keep learning to stand over good works unto the necessary needs, in order that they might not be unfruitful." Again, it comes back to what I already said, going to good works. And this idea of standing over them is more or less basically to be leading in or being the best at. That the people who are following God ought to be the ones who are doing this best, not anyone else who's trying to do them. And so it's basically trying to refocus the minds of the people back onto where it should be, rather than all these other side things and other stuff that's leading to the divisions and everything else. And that's what he's really sort of trying to sum it up with. But one of the problems here is that we don't have a great understanding of what good works actually looks like. We have thoughts, and none of them are necessarily wrong, but none of it fully grabs the picture, because again, it more is along the lines of setting up rules for how it's done or what it looks like and making it strict rather than allowing some of the broadness that actually exists with it. Again, we hear about, helping the poor and those who need help. Sometimes it's just doing evangelism or sharing the good news. Sometimes it's some kind of combination of it, but most of the time it's always set with you have to do it this way, or these are certain things that have to be done or whatnot, and it doesn't allow us to even understand what it actually is. But if we take a look at what the words themselves actually mean, I think it starts to give us a better picture. The word good has a whole bunch of different meanings. It can mean all kinds of things. Usually it's connected with something morally, and it's not that that's not true, but the most basic meaning is that something functions the way that it's supposed to function. So, as an example of that, basically all the lights in here are good lights except for that one, or even technically the big one, even though it's just because it's not turned on and has other problems, but it's sort of hard to change. But because they're actually functioning, giving off light the way that they're supposed to. Of course, they're only sort of good lights, because if you get a cloudy day here, it's still pretty dark in here because there's not much lighting in here in the first place, but they're still functioning and doing what they're supposed to be doing. Of course, if you go and probably just change that light bulb, that one probably works just fine, and so it would be a good light again. But it's the fact that something's functioning in the way that it's supposed to be. And so what we would find here is that good works means that it's work functioning the way that it's supposed to be. But for us to understand what work actually looks like, you have to go all the way back to the very beginning. And it connects closely with the idea of what it means to be setting things right. We see at the very beginning of Genesis 1 in the second verse that there was still chaos that existed. And so what most of Genesis 1 is about is God creating order out of that chaos. He creates order out of disorder. He sets things right out of the chaos that still existed. And it's sort of interesting that it's not until the very end in the last couple chapters of Revelation where it says that the sea existed no longer, which to the ancient people was where chaos existed. So it's not until Jesus returns that chaos is basically completely done away with. God didn't do it when he was creating, but he created man basically to help him do that. That man was supposed to help him finish the process of creation. That we see that that's what God actually does. It can be seen somewhat clearly in chapter 2, even though it's sort of hard to fully tell, but I read this somewhere that what Adam and Eve were supposed to do was make the rest of the earth a part of the Garden of Eden. It says that God planted a garden, and then it speaks about the man working the fields, working the stuff, and it seems to imply that there's quite likely the fact that they were supposed to go out and make the rest of the world not just like it, but to ultimately become a part of it. So that God's dwelling wasn't just in this garden, but it was on the entire earth. That's the way it was meant to be. But what God did is that he called people to join him in the process of making that happen. We get caught up in thinking that the works that people were supposed to do is just, being fruitful and multiplying, subduing the earth and controlling it, and just working the ground. And it's not as if that's not a part of it, but all of that is pointing to the fact that they were doing the same kind of things that God was doing. That when God was creating, he was doing such things, and so the people were supposed to join in with that. So really the definition I would give to what good works are is seeing whatever God is doing and joining in with it. So again, it would include all those stuff we talked about before, but it could be much broader than that. It could be things that we aren't even thinking about. It could be whatever it is that you believe that God is doing around you, and then joining in on that process. And that's really what all of this looks like. And again, that's what we see. What was happening in Genesis 1 and 2 is that God was calling them to join in what he was doing. It wasn't just those things. It was anything else that he might be doing that they were supposed to be joining in. And so it's still that same way for us. He finally ends the letter off by saying, "All the ones with me greet you. Greet the ones loving us in trust. Grace be with you all." And this is the final theme that we've seen throughout Titus, is the idea of grace. It was mentioned when I did the first sermon about chaos abounding that the problem was that there was basically no grace happening, or at least not grace toward other people in any sense. They were just wanting to control them and expecting them to have everything figured out. But yet we also saw that the grace of God is training people. So it's not just grace that gets you off from doing all the stuff that you've done, but it's also a grace that begins that changing process. In essence, grace does all of it. It's a part that goes through all of it, but it doesn't hold people to all the problems that they've done, but yet at the same time, it also leads them to a change of a different way of actually doing things. And so all of us this brings us back to the idea of letting go of control. That's ultimately the best way to describe what all of this looks like, is that for us to be letting go of that control. Obviously, most of what Titus is about is letting go of the controlling of other people, but it also includes the control that you have over yourself, is that has to be let go of. That grace can't exist when we're holding on to the control. You have to let go of some of it for that grace to actually be able to play itself out. And the problem is that this is such a hard process because it can easily be mistaken for the fact of just the one side of grace and forgetting about the training process and learning from it. It's the idea of that even as you're saying, oh, I see God doing this, and then going after it, and then realizing that he wasn't actually doing whatever you were seeking after doing, you just learn from that and then go on and try to figure things out. You don't lament over it for a long period of time and do whatever else it is that sometimes it feels like we think is a part of the repentance process, but we just learn from it and move on. Again, it may require some kind of reconciliation somewhere with something, but it's not allowing it to control your life. It's recognizing it and then seeking to move on from it. That's really what it means for us to actually even surrender in the first place. That's what all this boils down to. And even though I mostly just used the same background because I was trying to do this Wednesday morning before I went to work, I still think it fits because the idea of surrender ultimately has that fire behind it. As I've talked about before, surrender isn't about just the idea of authority and recognizing him as Lord and thinking we have to do whatever he tells us to do just out of obligation, because that just leads to bitterness and resentment. But instead, it's about recognizing the love of God and what he did and responding to that with the same kind of surrender. That's ultimately what it means to surrender and be letting go of control, is that we recognize the love of God of what he did, and it leads us to do the same sort of things as he was doing. It leads us, as I said, to recognize what he's doing in the world and then to seek to go after it. But in order for us to do that, we sometimes have to take a step back and just decide to follow him wherever he's going. Even when it doesn't make sense, even when it feels like there could be something wrong with it, we can't analyze stuff to death and never move on it. Somewhere along the way, we have to choose to actually go in the direction we think he's calling us to, and as we're going in that direction, figure out whether it truly is or not, and learn from it and figure out where to go from there. And again, that's what the training process is. It's not just it goes in and you get everything fixed and then you just know what to do from there or anything like that. It's a long process of which you learn mostly through failure. And we have to be okay with that. But that becomes the biggest problem because we want to control everything in our lives and other people's lives, and we don't want to allow failure to exist. But yet that's what Titus ultimately teaches us, that we have to allow failure to exist. We have to allow it to be able to teach and train us, and we have to be able to learn from there. The best way to learn is from other people's mistakes rather than your own, and through listening to that and hearing things that they've said, which again is the point of elders and other people leading you and sharing stuff, but yet sometimes you do just have to learn it from your own. But the real question we have is whether or not we're going to cling and hold on to the control, or whether or not we're going to let go of it and allow God to do whatever he's going to be doing in our lives, for us to just simply follow him. That's what he's called us to do, and that's the choice that we ought to be making.